suddenly you say something and part of you's like, can you just be prettier and more passive and more polite, because that's what women are told to be.
My name is Lynn Enright. I'm Head of News and Content at The Pool, and I'm here today in Stratford-upon-Avon to talk about women in Shakespeare and women who are working with Shakespearean texts here at the Royal Shakespeare Company. I'm joined by Charlie Josephine, an actor who's currently performing in Romeo and Juliet and The Merry Wives of Windsor, with Ayse Tashkiran, a movement director currently working at the RSC, and with Rebecca Cubitt, Head of Scenic Resources here at the RSC. So, we're meeting at a particularly exciting time for women at the RSC. There's been this amazing summer 2018 season where all the shows have been directed by women. We've seen brilliant female characters on the RSC stage, from Lady Macbeth to Joan Littlewood. There's been some really interesting regendering happening. Charlie, you're playing Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet, and Bardolph from The Merry Wives. And so there's a lot to celebrate, I think, here at this institution that's devoted, not entirely, but devoted to a man, you know, a brilliant man, but a man who was writing 400 years ago when our conversation about gender, when their conversation about gender was not particularly sophisticated. So I think we have lots to talk about women in Shakespeare and women working with Shakespeare. I think, though, perhaps we'll start by talking a little about what each person does, because, Charlie, you're an actor, and I think that, you know, audiences know what an actor does and they know what you do. They don't always know kind of your process to get on stage, but when you're on stage, they know what you're doing. But a movement director and head of scenic resources, I don't think audiences really know what those jobs are.
Yeah, so movement directors work with movement. And sometimes that might be movement that you can really see and is visible, and sometimes it can be quite invisible movement as well. So it'll be buried within actors' character choices or within chorus work or how the stage is operating. So I've just worked on Romeo and Juliet, and for example there I definitely took a lead on the big party scene. We have a party where there's a big free dance in it, but I also had input to other areas as well, which you might not have noticed.
So what would that be?
So other areas, for example, Charlie and I worked together quite a lot. I also worked a lot on the sort of intimacy between Romeo and Juliet to make that really plausible. We're in a 21st century setting, so I think the audience is particularly kind of attuned and have a very keen eye for what works, I suppose, in terms of interpersonal relationships. So Romeo and Juliet are very, I think they're very authentic in the way they are as teenagers, but also in their love story. Other moments that we have a whole kind of line of ghosts. I worked on the sort of body language of the ghosts and of dying. So that's quite a typical range of work for a movement practitioner. Yeah.
And what about Head of Scenic Resources? What does that entail?
The easiest way to explain it is that I'm in charge of the scenic workshops, so it's my responsibility to make sure that all of the sets for each production get on stage and are working and are done on time.
Okay, and is that, we're talking about gender, and I wonder, is that an area at the RSC that is, you know, behind the scenes? Are there more women or more men in that department?
There are definitely more men. Our engineering departments and carpentry departments are solely men, whereas in our drawing office and paint shop and prop shop it's a mixture. But generally backstage there are more males than females.
So I guess we want to talk about, you know, gender and acting. Here at the RSC it's quite interesting to talk about it, because we have a situation where, you know, there are a lot more male roles than female roles, but you guys and everybody at the RSC is addressing that by sort of, you know, casting imaginatively, and you're doing that at the moment. So can you tell us a bit about playing Mercutio and how that works, and what are the decisions that led to that?
Yeah, so Erica, who directs Romeo and Juliet, and Hannah, who's head of casting here, made that decision. And I'm really grateful that they did. It's a part that I've always wanted to play, and a part that I've never thought I'd get the opportunity to because of my gender. It feels really modern. It feels the whole casting of that show feels very modern and very urgent, and it feels like it's gently probing at our preconceptions of what Verona should be. So Beth plays Paris, Donna plays Gregory, and Katie Britton plays 2 male parts, and I play Mercutio, and they feel really valid, I think. And in terms of learning how to play it, Erica really provoked me to look at the text and really tease out those choices that are already there in the text. She's really passionate about looking at the words and the clues that are already there, and therefore making choices that are born out of that. She really provoked me to take up more space on stage, and it was really helpful having Ayse to feel braver in my body taking up space, because men do that more easily than women in life, I think. There's a certain entitlement that comes from particularly white, heterosexual, cis, middle-class, middle-aged men, that means that they will enjoy taking up space and probably not even think about it very much. But as soon as I got on that big stage that's quite masculine in its architecture, I felt suddenly very small and shy, and was really provoked to be big, because the character is larger than life, and so I mean physically and vocally, and with big ideas and big images, and to be really bold and in your face and confident with that, which was both terrifying and liberating. Mercutio is much braver than I am. She is ruder and more honest and sexier and sassier, and so doing that every night sometimes takes a bit of like gumption from me personally, to be like, oh, I've got to do that thing again where I'm really big in front of lots of people, and there's a tiny bit of my brain that's aware of the audience and how they're responding to that offer.
What do you mean?
In terms of like the energy in the room. So when we did the technical rehearsal, Erica and I decided that so the Queen Mab speech that I do, I directly address the audience, because this is theatre and it's live, and why wouldn't I directly talk to people that are in the room? And because the character's action is telling the truth, and a truth that people don't really like talking about. So it made sense that I would actually look at people in the audience and reference them, and that felt like an assault as an audience member. It suddenly felt a bit too aggressive, and I was very aware of that and found myself shying away from it in a way that perhaps women do in life, where suddenly you say something and part of you's like, can you just be prettier and more passive and more polite, because that's what women are told to be. And so I spoke to Erica about that, and we decided that we would lift the house lights up a little bit earlier. So it's a bit of a spoiler if you haven't seen it, but the house lights come up at the start of that scene in quite a subtle way, and I instantly engage with the audience in a cheeky, welcoming way, so that then when I do it in a slightly more provocative way, they're warmed up to it. So we were very aware of not problems, but potential challenges that an audience might have of seeing some of those gender shifts.
And Ayse, how did you guys work together to create this character? Because, you know, you're saying that it's quite a masculine energy to this sort of, you know, this person who takes up a lot of space. But at the same time, your Mercutio is played by you, a woman. So you're not playing a man per se, but the character has sort of become female or become non-binary, or how did you kind of make that decision, and how did you make that physically?
Yeah, I guess you know, one of the things that I think I brought to the table was to sort of dissolve any kind of references to male and female, and actually really try and deal with the qualities that the character might have, and also Charlie as an actress brings amazing qualities already in that she's got incredible fitness levels, and the Queen Mab speech is, you know, an enormous piece of text, and because, you know, Charlie brought particular kind of aptitudes, it was a real joy to work on that and sort of see whether we could bring in more range to that in terms of what was happening physically. So yeah, I guess, you know, taking up space is really important for you know, these spaces, because they are enormous and they're quite, you know, being a bit athletic in those spaces is quite helpful. But in terms of gender, we never talked about gender. What we did was activate lots of qualities, and the moment you think about that, like, any gender can access all sorts of qualities. So if you're a male and you've got to be soft and yielding, then you can be soft and yielding. So it's sort of in the nature of actors to use the kind of elements of transformation and range anyway. But because Charlie has this athletic past, we definitely harness that. And then I think in terms of just qualities, we brought in kind of more slow, more upright qualities, as well as qualities that were sort of heavier, more grounded, more open, more indulgent with the space, I suppose. So yeah, we worked on one-on-one sessions, and I guess the really interesting thing about, you know, working with a regendered character is that you often have to realign everybody else around it, because they're all sort of holding on to some kind of gendered perception. So actually, weirdly, taking up space is sometimes getting other people to take up less space, for example. So, you know, that's a kind of subtle calibration. Yeah, and, you know, the dances, for example, in this production aren't really choreographed as such. They were born out of this big kind of warm-up that we would do, a big sort of free dance warm-up. And then gradually moulded into something which tells the narrative, you know. And I guess that way of working is very much about really seeing who is in the space and what they have to bring to the party, I guess. And if you've got an actress who's, you know, in her 50s, and you've got an actor who's barely 18, you know, they're going to bring different movement qualities. And it's something about sort of enhancing and celebrating that.
Something about that way of working that is really freeing. Because it comes from an honesty that's within my body that I can't even articulate. That's like, this is just the way my body moves, rather than trying to learn some alien choreography that might not. That can sometimes be liberating in itself, because you're like, oh, this is so outside of me that it's fun to learn how to get there. But for this kind of work and for this production, I really appreciate the choice to make a dance that comes from the inside out, and just because it just feels more authentic, I think. And can I just add on to something that you said about dissolving the gender? I feel like that the day that first happened on the one-on-one session that we had was a huge shift for me in rehearsals, and I feel like is a political gesture in itself in terms of the work. That if theatre is about creating opportunities for empathy, where an audience member can see someone on stage that represents them in some way, or they can see that me too. Yes, I know that person, I know what they're feeling. Oh, they've got the same colour skin as me, or oh, they're messing around with gender in a way that's exciting for me, or oh, they've got the same accent. That's part of what's so wonderful about theatre, is that live in this room there's a whole load of humans, and we create these opportunities for empathy. It feels like this production, the dissolving of gender was really useful for that, and personally was really helpful for me to go, oh yeah, none of that stuff matters. You know, all of the words, if the words are freeing for you to use, then go for it. But I don't need to label myself in terms of am I queer, am I non-binary, am I gender fluid, am I, like, yes to all of it, I think.
And we're having this discussion, I think, at in a year when women and non-binary people are I suppose, to the fore, you know, here at the Royal Shakespeare Company, but in general, I think we're having a lot of difficult conversations and interesting conversations about women at work and about women in the arts, women on screen, women on stage. How have you felt that in your work here at the RSC and in your work on stage?
It's felt very alive. I guess as a movement person, you're very close to the body. Anyway, that's in the nature of the work, I guess. So I think movement practitioners for years have been thinking about how to care, empower, liberate, you know, get people to be the fullest version of themselves that they can be through movement, you know. And I think for a long time we've been working with languages that kind of take away a sense of judgment or sense of closing down a body. So I'd love to say that I think movement people have been sort of at the forefront of trying to make sure that people, actors who are often in very vulnerable places where they don't know what they're about to do. So, you know, sort of trying to hold that. And I think the current climate, and certainly being here during this year, has been a sort of time to sort of breathe out, be surrounded by a sort of certain kind of politics around gender in terms of the stories that we want to tell and retell in certain ways. So I think it's been a kind of great relief in some ways to be here. Having said that, I feel like I've worked on and off since 2009, and I don't think there's ever been a time when gender hasn't been a sort of point of discussion, and that might just be because I work with female directors with very particular politics, so the kind of recasting of gendered roles, or sort of being very, very conscious and caring about how you cast in terms of race and ethnicity. That conversation's been ongoing for years. I guess what's lovely now is that we all have a platform for discussion, and I think certainly at the RSC had very interesting discussions this year about nuances around that. I think there's still lots of work to do, you know, how you run a rehearsal room and how you try and care for the people in the rehearsal room is one thing, but then of course we're on stages where we can't control what everybody says about other people in terms of how critics might use language or how audiences will feed back to actors. But I think certainly as a kind of artistic collaborator, it's been a really great season. And I think sort of I've always felt like I've been part of teams of women, which has been great. I think what was really surprising this season was sort of looking out in the Duchess of Malfi tech and just sort of seeing like the whole crew for one moment was all female. And I was like, oh, okay, that's lighting and that's sound and that's stage. And like I suddenly felt really hopeful for those younger women who are being kind of nurtured into the industry in a way that's very front-footed. And I really hope that I would do that as a movement practitioner as well. But I think certainly in areas where women are underrepresented, that's great to see that happening here.
Yeah, Becky, your area is one in which women are underrepresented.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could tell us why you think that is and if you think that's changing.
I definitely think it's changing, and we've had a shift in, I mean, I've only worked for this company for 2.5 years, and in my time here we've had a shift where there have been more females that are starting to work at the workshops and take on different roles within the company. I think part of it is historical, and my side of it is more sort of manufacturing than artistic. So where you get on stage and you have those discussions and you want to have a sort of a political reason for doing it or want different ways of doing things. In the manufacturing side, you don't necessarily have those conversations. You wouldn't walk into a factory that builds fridges and ask why there weren't any women on the factory line. And it's one of the good things about working for the RSC and having the company sort of involve every department within the company in all of these conversations is that what we're trying to do on stage then does actually affect everybody else and help improve the situations for people to get involved.
So kind of what happens on stage goes backstage and vice versa. I guess that's an interesting thing to consider. You know, you're talking about women directors, and this season with women directors, what does that mean for audiences? You know, what does it mean for actors? What does it mean for movement directors? What does it mean for the technical team? And then how does that translate to an audience?
It feels great. It feels really great as a woman to have brilliant female directors here. I feel really excited by that choice. Because the work will be different. The work potentially will be made from a female gaze. So the choices might be slightly more sophisticated sometimes in terms of sexual politics, I think. Especially in terms of like violence against women, which runs throughout all of the plays written by men for some reason.
Certainly Shakespeare.
So yeah, so it's there. So it's in the story, it's in the text. We need to address it. How are we going to do that? And there's something about having, if not always a female-led team, but at least a more mixed. I just feel like the work's going to be richer and more nuanced and better because there's a wider range of people that are making it. So therefore, it's going to allow opportunity for empathy to a wider range of people. So I think surely it's gonna be better.
And I mean I think many of Shakespeare's plays, maybe not some of the comedies, or maybe the comedies as well, but the ones that I've worked on sort of have a terrain that you can occupy in a really interesting way to say something about violence and death and invasions of bodies, and I think the directors that I've been lucky enough to work with have been incredibly sharp on how that is going to be presented. You know, working with stage combat people as well who are women, it does bring a different kind of language to the room, in that, you know, you might be you'll have a lived experience of some of the cliches that you've seen or you've witnessed, and you're sort of saying to yourself, well, I will absolutely not work within those cliches. We do have to bring something new, and maybe we need to find a new language. Maybe we need to abstract this, or maybe we have to like really shine a light on this moment of you know, domestic violence between a father and a daughter. You know, so I do feel like there are some very clear areas that have been sort of born out of the discussion, and because we're looking at each other and just kind of going, well, you know, I'm sick of seeing dead women, so why not? Why doesn't she get up at the end as an actress and watch this carnage? You know, so that was the end of Duchess of Malfi. So this incredibly strong, muscular black woman who is playing Duchess of Malfi rises out of the carnage and somehow witnesses the result of the story. So there are lots of different ways that I think directors and actors are feeding into that process of trying to make new images and tell the stories in a new way, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that in Romeo and Juliet as well,
Yeah.
where that scene with Juliet and her dad, and I you know, I've read that play 100 times and just kind of been like, I don't know, because it permeates so much of our art, that I just almost haven't seen it. Yeah. And the way that it is in our production, like, I was shocked by it, and I hear a lot of people are shocked by it, and it feels like it's a product of his toxic masculinity. Like, it feels like it's about him and his shame and his fear and his need for control. It feels like a really nuanced performance from both of them in that scene. That's exciting and feels fresh and feels new.
Completely. And also, rehearsal rooms are incredibly collaborative. So I think, you know, when the people in the room make the collaboration happen. So when you've got a really good broad range of people, you've got more voices in a room, you know. So instead of having, you know, two isolated women playing women's roles, you have a critical mass. So you are going to have a more interesting conversation. And that's not to negate, like, everyone has a voice in that. It's not like men aren't allowed to talk anymore. You know, there's definitely, like, we're all in the world together, so we're all interested in how we're negotiating this together, I think. And, you know, it is really touching sometimes, because, you know, we are also changed by the work we make as well. So actors who kind of say to you, oh, I think I really discovered something new about this. You kind of go, that's quite good, isn't it? That we are also changed. You know.
I think it's really interesting that, you know, teenagers come to the RSC, you know, people come here with their school, and to see these sort of situations happening, to see the regendering of roles, you know, I think that's really interesting for them. I wonder how have young people responded to the regendering, to Mercutio?
Well, your daughter came.
Yeah, so I brought my daughter to see Romeo and Juliet, and she's been doing it in her GCSEs, so she knew the text really well. And she didn't come out of it sort of going, oh, well, I thought that should have been a male role or that should have been a female role. She just completely accepted that that was the production and that was the way that it had been staged. And it almost wasn't an issue to her as to who was playing what role, which I think is, when I was in school and did it, we would have definitely have questioned it. And I think society's moved on in that way when they're looking at gender roles.
And then how does that compare to the sort of, you know, to the different end of the audience, you know, people maybe tourists or older people, I suppose, who might expect something more traditional, you know?
I've had a real mix in responses. It's mainly been positive. I'm proud to say, like, I think it's a really great production, and I'm really proud and grateful to be part of it. So the response has mainly been positive. A lot of women have come up to me quite teary-eyed and were excited by seeing so many women on stage, and the idea of a woman getting to play a big part like that and take up space is inspiring, I think. I've had a few comments from people that feel like the RSC are going too far, and they want things to be more traditional, and they're confused by the diversity of Verona in terms of race and accent and gender. So yeah, it's been a mix. It's been interesting. Some of the best conversations I've had are when people have asked questions rather than just telling me their opinion. It's something I'm learning. It's something I'm learning to do as well. I think of that thing of, like, I want to be teachable and I want to ask questions and have conversations. And I feel it's funny, in this conversation I feel a bit kind of shy and sweaty, and I think it's because we really care about this stuff and it goes really deep. Like, and for some the conversation about diversity, or it might feel like ticking boxes in an Arts Council application, but it really isn't. It's about primal human gut stuff. Like, I feel blushy and hot talking about it because it comes from a place that's really human and raw and honest. So it's great that the response is negative or positive. It's great that they're hot.
And do you feel more comfortable talking about that now than maybe a couple of years ago? Does the conversation feel more open, do you think? Or not?
Yeah, I mean, when I auditioned for drama school, I had to pick a part that was written for a woman, which is really hard to find a speech. You know, I wanted to do the Hamlet speech and I wasn't allowed. And I hope that students now are allowed to just pick the speech that best represents them as an actor, regardless of age or gender. And I think audiences are more open to it now, and there are so many times where you watch a production now or you have a conversation like this and people go, well, yeah, it's obvious. Like the reaction of your daughter, who's just like, yeah, cool, whatever, like just not bothered. And the more people that have reactions like that, I think that's a really good thing. I'm like, yeah.
Because I read that you said, you know, you didn't feel like a typical Juliet, or that wasn't a role that really interested you as you were sort of training or a young actor. And I wonder why that is, but also what you would say to young actors, young female actors leaving drama school who don't feel like they're a Juliet or an ingenue. They don't want those parts, or they don't feel like those parts suit them. How do they find the work that does work for them, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think focusing on the text, focusing on the language, and being like, I love saying these words, and if you have a problem with me saying these words, that's your problem. And the opportunities for me to get to say these words are opening up with women like this who are opening doors for, you know, I'm really grateful for the women that have come before me that are opening doors for me, and I hope that I get the opportunity to do that for other young women that, I think it's all about the text. We just want to tell stories at the end of the day, don't we? And so as much as we can dissolve that stuff and just get to the heart of it, you know, just just tell a good story that when we finish, the audience want to clap.
Well, you know what? I think that sounds like a brilliant note to end on. I think that is exactly what we want to get to. You know, we have a lot to chat about gender, but exactly it's about more than that, really. It's about telling a really good story in a really interesting way to make the audience clap. Yeah. Don't know if anyone has anything else they really want to say.
I guess just to sort of pitch in, I think the politics of rehearsal rooms are quite interesting and a sort of nuanced place, and I think the wider conversation has had a really beneficial impact on that, where actually all sorts of voices, quiet voices and loud voices, are being listened to, and I think that's great. And we've been lucky enough to work with Erica, who is just, you know, runs the most amazing rehearsal room, where actually like difference and debate and nuance is all allowed, and I think that's a really heartening thing. So there's something about the environment and the kind of the sort of more quiet place of a rehearsal room kind of coming together to speak to each other more clearly, and I'd hope that younger or more emergent actors and actresses would always feel like they could speak up, speak out, you know, whether that's to do with discomfort or whether that's to do with, you know, other ranges of things. But I think sort of keeping quiet is no longer an option in terms of both how the industry is run, but also like how one contributes to a creative endeavour. So that's what I would hope for younger actors and actresses, that they can actually speak out. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for talking to me today. That was really, really interesting, and I hope that everybody watching found it really interesting too. I think there's loads to unpack, rather, and loads to sort of think about and go forward with. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.